And one important individual to mention in this is actually an individual who's actually lived his life much, he's much older than the time where he was actually recognized and sort of contributed to industry, and that was William Champion Jack Dupree. So William Thomas Dupree, also known as Champion Jack, he was a boogie woogie sort of blues musician. Boogie woogie is basically as old as a blues, but it's more known to be piano based. It kind of has it's usually faster. It's kind of a more dance oriented. Um, has more of like a rolling uh, beat. It's something that you definitely recognize if you hear it. Um, so he was known for boogie woogie and blues, and his sound sort of over time evolved into like to what was known as jump blues at the time. But that was later down in his career because quite a few life events, as we'll go over, happened before he could ever really become a musician and pursue that area of his life. Um, One thing that of note early in his life, his parents died when he was an infant in a grocery store fire. Their grocery store burnt down, and according to Champion Jack Dupree, the fire was started by KKK members, which could definitely be true. Nobody really knows, but there has also been times where he said that the fire just started from kerosene, like a kerosene container that was for lamps, and it just exploded, spontaneous explosion, and the store burned down. Either way, tragic. And due to this, he was placed in an orphanage um, and lived there, till he was in his teens. And that was where he actually first learned to play piano at this orphanage. And then he left in his teens. This is in New Orleans. He left and became homeless, mostly homeless. He stayed with people here and there, and including one of his other mentors who helped him further learn on the piano. But generally, he was primarily homeless until he learned to box. He learned to box as a form of survival on the streets, and then that led to a actual professional boxing career, which he was pretty successful in. He fought, over 100 fights. Like a successful fighter, and that's where his name Champion Jack came from. He he won like Golden Glove. I guess it would have been the Golden Gloves of Louisiana, maybe. I'm pretty sure. Actually, no. His boxing career was in the Midwest, so I'm not sure. Probably would have been the Golden Gloves of either Michigan or Indiana. I'm not sure how. I mean, generally, Golden Gloves is state by state. I don't know how it was back then. That was quite a long time ago. Um, but successful boxer, got the name Champion Jack, and and so he leaves boxing largely because of the war, and he was drafted into the war in 1942, I think it would have been. And so, 1942, he's in the war. He started off as a cook, naval cook, and then while he was in action, he got deployed into action. He was captured by the Japanese army, and he was actually a prisoner of war for 3 years until 1945, where he was eventually released and returned to the U.S. And actually, when he was captured, he was married at the time, and his wife passed away while he was a prisoner of war. And so, I guess one note is before he went to war, I think it was 1940, is when he recorded Junker Blues. He basically retired from boxing, got his first record deal, recorded that song among others, but you know, almost right after you know he was drafted and then went to war. So he was just about to get his record career started. Um, and then after that, he after the war he lived. I believe he moved to since his wife passed away. He was living in the Midwest, and since his wife passed away, he didn't really want to go back there. Didn't really have ties there, so he moved to New York instead. And he recorded during that time under a ton of names. And it it said that he recorded for like 21 different labels during the time under a bunch of different names. And then finally, he's at one point he started to just record under his own name for King Records in Cincinnati / New York. There's two locations, and he recorded there for a few years, and then finally he just left the United States altogether. He moved to Europe in 1958. He was just, he was over it. Was just had a lot of. He's always been very socially active, concerned, and so just some of the things that were happening in the U.S. did not sit well with him. And in general, a lot of black musicians at the time went over to Europe to start a career just because a lot of musicians found that the Europeans were providing them with a lot more respect and just opportunity and dignity that a lot of black musicians and a lot of black people in general were not getting in the U.S. So he ended up moving there and staying there for basically his whole career, remaining career. He did come back a few times, especially in the end of his career, to go on some tours and to for some visits, but primarily he performed and recorded in Europe, England, Europe. He lived in Germany for a large period of that time. He in the early 1960s, I guess end of the 1950s, he performed with a lot of musicians and was I think a huge catalyst to the blues revival, the British invasion of music, blues rock music that occurred around that time, just because his jump blues style, that kind of boogie woogie R&B-esque sort of kind of rocky blues sound matched or went along with a lot of the artists. At that point, this was the 1960s, late 1950s. At that point, rock was already out, rock and roll, and so it kind of laid the groundwork for this sort of R&B rock in Europe to kind of form. And I mean, it had already formed in the U.S., but it really brought that sound over there and created definitely a unique version. The British invasion rockers sounded different than the American performers to a degree. But as I said, a lot of black musicians went over to Europe to perform over there, so it wasn't like these sounds were created independently. But Champion Jack Dupree was definitely a very interesting person. He had a way with words, just like the tragedy of his parents. In general, he was his lyrics. He's really well known for the lyrical content in his songs. If you listen to Junker Blues or some of these other songs, he's very slick with his words, and interesting. It's hard to tell what is truth and what isn't. Just and not even in a deceitful way, just in a creative way. I think another funny story about him was he had this tattoo of a heart on his arm. I think it was his arm, but he had this half heart basically, and he had been reportedly sent to prison for I think maybe 30 days or something like that for stealing oranges, which is you know so he goes to jail or prison for this, and the tattoo artist was giving him this prison tattoo. And what his story is, he only has half the heart. Apparently, this tattoo artist prison tattoo that was getting, the artist was unfortunately executed before he finished the tattoo, so he only has half a heart, which is interesting because it's exactly half a heart. So that's the funny part. I mean, obviously execution is not funny at all, but it's an interesting, entertaining story because it's one of those things where, is it true? Is it not? But he's a very interesting character, someone who kind of gets brushed under in music history a little bit.